Long before any geologist came with maps, surveys, and technical language, the people living along the shores of Lake Albert, they already knew that something strange lay beneath their feet. Fishermen around Kibiro, they had already seen oily seepages coming out of the ground for generations, and they used that substance in practical ways, like to waterproof boats and to treat skin conditions. The knowledge was local, ordinary, and inherited. It lived in memory long before it lived in official archives. So you can already see that Uganda's oil story, it didn't begin with a corporation or with a state. It began with communities that had already encountered petroleum in its rawest form before anyone had turned it into a national dream, a geopolitical asset, or a billion-dollar extraction project. The first outsider to document that local knowledge in formal scientific terms was E.J. Wayland. This was a British government geologist working under the Uganda Protectorate. In 1925, Wayland published Petroleum in Uganda in Nature, recording hydrocarbon occurrences along the Albertine Graben and concluding that the basin had genuine petroleum potential. This was the first authoritative scientific confirmation that Western Uganda sat on a potentially valuable hydrocarbon system. And yet, nothing transformative followed. The colonial administration had already imagined East Africa in a particular way. This was a region for agriculture, labor, and raw commodities of a different kind. Oil frontiers in the colonial imagination, it belonged elsewhere, especially in West Africa. So Uganda's geological inheritance, it was identified, recorded, and then effectively shelved for decades. The next chapter, it was a long one, and for the most part, a frustrating one. In 1936, the African European Investment Company of South Africa, it began drilling shallow stratigraphic wells near Butiaba. In 1938, it drilled Waxy B1, and this is regarded as Uganda's first deep exploration well, and the well encountered bitumen, confirming hydrocarbon presence without proving commercial viability. Over the next 2 decades, more than 20 shallow wells were drilled around Kibiro and Kibuku. This was mostly for geological understanding rather than commercial extraction. And the results, they were eventually folded into the Geological Survey Memoirs of 1959. Then the story stalled again. The Second World War interrupted exploration, and post-independence Uganda did the rest. Between 1962 and 1986, the country passed through coups, wars, instability, and repeated governance crises that made long-term frontier exploration look less like investment and more like self-harm. Western Uganda may have been somewhat removed from the worst violence, but it was still remote, close to the Congo border, and more than 1,000 kilometers from Mombasa, which is the nearest major port. For most international oil companies, that was enough reason to stay away. The 1970s briefly reopened the question. The Iranian Revolution, nationalizations in major oil-producing regions, and the global search for the non-OPEC reserves. Those renewed interest in frontier basins around the world. East Africa drew some attention in that scramble, but Uganda was still too politically unstable to become a serious destination for sustained petroleum investment. A more important shift came in 1983 when a World Bank-sponsored aeromagnetic survey covered 9,578 line kilometers across the Albertine Graben and identified 3 depot centers with potential for petroleum accumulation. That survey became the geological cornerstone for what followed. Then in 1985, Uganda passed its first Petroleum Act, the Exploration and Production, giving the country an initial legal framework for the sector. The state now had both a basin worth investigating and a legal mechanism through which it could eventually be licensed. Then Museveni came to power. When Yoweri Kaguta Museveni's National Resistance Army entered Kampala on 25th January 1986, Uganda's political order changed, and so did the pace and direction of the oil story. The common expectation was that a new government would rush to sign deals and chase petroleum money. Museveni did not move that way. He is widely reported to have halted ongoing negotiations with international oil companies, not because he believed there was no oil, but because he wanted Uganda to build enough state capacity to manage the sector before giving away rights too cheaply. Before Uganda could become an oil state, it had to become a state capable of speaking the language of oil. Ugandan geoscientists were sent abroad for specialized training. A petroleum unit was created in 1990 within the Geological Survey and Mines Department, and in 1991, it was reorganized into the Petroleum Exploration and Production Department, PEPD, within the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. That department would become the institutional ancestor of today's Petroleum Authority of Uganda. In other words, before the rigs came in serious numbers, Uganda was trying to build a bureaucratic brain for the sector. Museveni's government also set policy direction around capacity building, data acquisition, promotion of the basin, and compliance monitoring. In 1990, Uganda signed a cooperation agreement with Zaire, now it's the DRC, and this cooperation agreement was for joint exploration and the development of cross-border fields along Lake Albert, an agreement that was never fully implemented but remained legally significant. State capacity alone could not produce oil. Uganda needed companies willing to take geological and political risks. The first PSA under the new institutional framework, it was signed in 1991 with Petrofina Exploration Uganda, a subsidiary of the Belgian company FINA, covering the entire Albertine Graben. It was an extraordinary generous concession. One company was given rights across Uganda's whole western hydrocarbon basin, but Petrofina failed to execute its obligations, and its license was not renewed in 1993. Another PSA with a small American company in 1995, it also went nowhere. Uganda was learning a brutal lesson very early. If you're a landlocked country with uncertain reserves, weak infrastructure, and a risky reputation, you don't negotiate like a giant. You negotiate like someone trying to convince the room that you're worth the trouble. The real turning point came in 1997. That year, the government licensed Heritage Oil and Gas Limited, a Jersey-registered company controlled by Tony Buckingham, to Exploration Area 3 in the Semliki Basin. Heritage was the first company in decades to pursue exploration in Uganda with seriousness and continuity. It was not a conventional oil major, and Tony Buckingham was not a conventional oil executive. Buckingham had a background that sat uncomfortably at the intersection of frontier extraction, military contracting, and private power. A former North Sea diver with the connections to the world of security contracting, he was associated with Executive Outcomes, the notorious private military company that operated in Angola and Sierra Leone in the 1990s. Critics argued that the same kind of networks used to move mercenaries, logistics, intelligence, and protection through unstable territory, they were being adapted for frontier oil work in volatile parts of Africa. In Uganda, Heritage received security support from the UPDF and from private security actors, including the Ugandan subsidiary of Saraken International, partly owned by Museveni's brother, General Salim Saleh. So even at this early stage, Uganda's oil story was already entangled with the security state. In the same period, Hadman Resources of Australia and Energy Africa, they were licensed into Exploration Area 2, the Northern Lake Albert Basin. Heritage conducted Uganda's first 2D seismic survey in 1998, then expanded that work in 2001. Between 2002 and 2004, Heritage and Energy Africa drilled Turaco 1, Turaco 2, and Turaco 3, the first deep wells of the modern exploration area. Those wells confirmed a working petroleum system, but what they found was natural gas, heavily contaminated by carbon dioxide, not commercial oil. That could have killed the story, but it didn't. The results were disappointing, but they were not fatal. They told geologists something absolutely crucial. The basin was alive. There was charge, there was migration, and there was a system. The problem was not whether petroleum existed, but where the commercially significant oil accumulations actually sat. Then came one of the most important technical milestones in the whole story. In 2003, Hadman Resources, working with Syracuse University, it carried out the first integrated 2D seismic survey directly across Lake Albert itself, covering 1,589 line kilometers across the lake. That survey identified major subsurface structures and highlighted features that suggested trapped hydrocarbons. Among the structures identified were Kingfisher and Ngasa, names that would later become central to Uganda's petroleum future. In 2004, Heritage and Energy Africa acquired additional licenses in Exploration Area 1 and Exploration Area 3A. But the bigger change that year happened at the corporate level. Tullow Oil, the British-based independent known for its appetite for frontier African plays, it bought Energy Africa for around $500 million and acquired its interests in Uganda. Then, in 2007, Tullow completed its acquisition of Hadman Resources, consolidating its position in Block 2 while holding substantial interests in Block 1 and 3A. Through those acquisitions, Tullow moved from the edge of the story to the center of it. By 2005 and early 2006, the geological setup for a breakthrough had been assembled with real precision. Hadman and Energy Africa, now tied to Tullow's expanding position, it acquired more 2D seismic data over the Kaiso-Tonya area on the eastern shore of Lake Albert in Hoima district. The target lay south of the active Paraa oil seep, near Murchison Falls National Park, and the seismic data pointed toward a drillable rift flank fold prospect. To keep costs manageable in such a remote inland setting, the operators brought in a light containerized rig known as the Eagle drill. It was transported overland from South Africa. This is where the story starts to become both geological and most absurdly consequential. The geologists had identified two major play types in the basin: rift flank extensional folds and intra-rift tilted fault blocks. They were also working with a remarkably efficient petroleum system. The basin held a Miocene-age lacustrine solid rock, rich in organic material and interlaid closely with porous reservoir sands, which meant hydrocarbons did not have to migrate very far to be trapped. The seepages observed for centuries around Kibiro and Paraa, they were signs of active recent migration. The basin was charging in real time. And then there was the crude itself. Uganda's oil was not light, easy-flowing crude. It was waxy, with a pour point of roughly 36 to 39 degrees Celsius, meaning that at ordinary ambient temperatures, it could begin to behave more like wax than freely moving liquid. That sounds like a technical detail until you understand what it means. It meant Uganda was discovering oil that could not simply be pushed through a normal export pipeline. From the very first serious results, the feature logic of commercialization already contained a trap. Any long-distance export route would require heat along the entire system. That one physical property sits at the root of why EACOP would later become so expensive, so technically demanding, and so politically contested. Then came the breakthrough. Around 6th January 2006, Hardman drilled the Mputa-1 exploration well in Kaiso-Tonya and encountered around 10 meters of net oil pay in two zones. The well tested at more than 1,100 barrels per day. By the standards of giant global basins, that was not earth-shattering, but by the standards of the African Rift System and Uganda's own long history of uninterrupted exploration, it was a historic event. Mputa-1 was the first confirmed commercial oil discovery in Uganda's history. This was the moment Uganda ceased to be a speculative frontier and became a real petroleum province. Mputa proved the rift flank extensional fold play in the Kaiso-Tonya area. Once that was clear, the companies moved quickly to test adjacent structures.